With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
When cool, creamy ranch meets tangy, bold buffalo, the whole is greater than the sum of its sauce. Say howdy, partner, to new Buffalo Ranch sauce. Only at McDonald's for a limited time.
At participating McDonald's.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we're talking about a familiar theme, but I hope it's an unfamiliar angle. I'm joined by PPF regular guest, the historian Chris Clark, to explore how history can help us understand the leadership of a politician like Donald Trump. And we are going to be looking specifically at German history, but we are not going to be talking about Hitler or the Nazis or the 1930s. We're going to be going further back. And today, our comparison is not with an elected politician. It is not with a tyrant or a dictator. It is with an emperor king, a Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who presided over Germany's entrance into the First World War, Germany's destruction in the First World War. Is Kaiser Wilhelm II the Trump-like leader in German history? Chris, we're talking about Kaiser Wilhelm II as Donald Trump, or maybe we're talking about Donald Trump as Kaiser Wilhelm. I'm not sure. We'll have to work out which way around it goes. But let's start with Wilhelm, because I think he's the one who needs probably more background explanation for people listening, and then we'll get on to the comparison. So just tell us a bit about him, but particularly, why is he still an object of such fascination for historians?
Well, he was the last German Kaiser, so he was the last example of a monarchical head of state in Germany. He was a colourful figure. He was in some ways the first truly imperial figure in that line of Kaisers, which was actually still a very young line. The German Empire, the Kaiserreich, had only been created in 1871. Its first emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I, was on the throne until 1888, from 1871 till 1888. That was Wilhelm's grandfather. Then his father spent 99 days on the throne, only to die relatively young of laryngeal cancer, of a very aggressive throat cancer. And then, somewhat earlier than people had expected, suddenly Wilhelm II came to the throne. And so he was on the throne from 1888 until 1918. You know, a long period of time and an extremely eventful and momentous one in the history of Germany, of Europe, and the world. So for all those reasons, he sort of stands out.
And how much of the story, when historians tell it, is about trying to work back from the First World War, and ultimately the catastrophe of the First World War, and essentially apportion blame? I mean, it's part of the story here, and we'll get on to, again, the contemporary parallels, but is part of the story here people trying to work out, in this monarchical system in which the politicians were nominally in charge, nonetheless, how much of the ultimate responsibility for the catastrophe could reside with this man? Because we're going to talk about his personality, his character. That's where the comparison really lies. But this is also a conversation about power, personal power, and how it works. Is that part of the puzzle with Wilhelm? Is he to blame?
Well, whether he's to blame or not, I mean, that's a question with vast ramifications. But certainly the question of whether he was to blame was an important question that was asked by many important people. And at the end of the First World War, there was something called the Hang the Kaiser campaign, driven in particular by the British, who were very keen to round up the Kaiser and execute him for war crimes and so on, and for starting the war. But it turned out, I mean, that never happened because he fled to Holland, and the Dutch actually sort of protected him. He had close connection with the Dutch royal family and actually owed a lot to Holland. And so in his sort of Dutch refuge, as it were, a Dutch asylum, he was a sort of asylum seeker, if you like, in Holland, and there he remained. And the efforts to sort of bring him to justice didn't succeed, but it's doubtful that they would have succeeded, even if any kind of normal procedure had been followed, because there was not very much in the way of precedent for arresting and trying a head of state in that way. Interestingly enough, the precedent that was produced and about which there was a lot of discussion was Napoleon, because at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon was famously confined to the island of Elba. Then he escaped, caused mischief again for the famous 100 Days, was beaten again at Waterloo, and then confined to the island of St. Helena. So, that was often presented as a sort of precedent for holding a head of state to account, though, of course, Napoleon famously was not hanged, just exiled and imprisoned. So that question of the extent to which the Kaiser was to blame was an important one, and it's loomed very large in the literature about the Kaiser. I mean, he's still a very controversial figure, and the literature about him is full of controversy.
So let's do some of these comparisons and just tease out some of the aspects of his personality, because you've written a book about him, and to read it now, it's a fascinating story. He's an extraordinary figure, and as you say, these 30 years are as action-packed as any in the history of Europe, and indeed of Germany. But these sentences in your book, they kind of leap out because you feel like you could be reading about Donald Trump. So I'm going to give you a few of the things that you wrote about Kaiser Wilhelm II, and then let's explore what this means for understanding Wilhelm first, and then maybe get on to present matters. So one aspect of his political personality, and one of the things that made him unusual and also made people at the time not know how to deal with him, including how seriously to take him, was his style of communication. So I'm going to read you one line from your book. Of the Kaiser, you wrote, "He found it virtually impossible to express himself in the sober, measured diction that the politically informed public clearly expected of him. The plangent, subjective tone of many of his public utterances seemed calculated to invite commentators to thematize the personality of the speaker." Plangent, subjective tone, unable to express himself in the sober, measured diction that we expect of heads of state. Did Wilhelm display that from the beginning? Was it something that got worse over time? How and why was he this kind of communicator?
Well, I think this is a very interesting and important question, and I do want to come to it. But first of all, it might be worth pointing out that there's a lot of discussion in the biographical studies and in general in the discussion of this emperor, this monarch, about his mental state. The question, was he sane? I mean, basically, there are two questions about Wilhelm. One is, was he bad? And the other is, was he mad? And if we take the mad first, or was he mentally unhealthy in some way? And this is as old as the sort of modern literature on Wilhelm II. There are efforts to diagnose his relationship with his parents. There was a famous psycho-historical biography of the Kaiser by a man called Kohut, who argued that, insufficient care and love from the parents produced an immature personality, prone to irritability, narcissism, lacking empathy, and so on. But then came John Röhl, who developed over an enormous span of years and of research a very sophisticated account of the Kaiser's birth, because the Kaiser was born with a lamed arm, a lamed left arm, and that was because of the application of forceps. He was a forceps birth because he was born breech and had to be turned around and so on. Getting him out into the world was a difficult process and involved a use of forceps which damaged the brachial plexus, a sort of network of nerves around the arm. So the arm was lamed, and the question was any other damage done during this birth? And John Röhl, who was a magnificently assiduous and determined and even stubborn researcher, went into every conceivable piece of evidence about the obstetrical process and found that given the combination of the drugs that were being used on his mother to ease her labor, the time he spent in the birth canal and the possible effects of the use of forceps, the position of the umbilical cord and so on, that it was possible, to John Röhl it seemed quite likely, that he was suffering from a sort of oxygen insufficiency. and that he was a so-called blue baby, is the term that used to be used. And he argued that this caused neurological damage, and that then later developments in his life caused secondary neuroticizations, which produced this, as Word put it, uniquely incontinent personality, someone who was incapable of sticking to one subject for very long, who used any conversation as an opportunity to say whatever was in his head, who just seemed to be constantly unbosoming himself of his latest preoccupations, and they could be quite esoteric preoccupations. He might suddenly be very interested in the Hittite language, for example, or he might then be interested in radio telegraphy, or, why is Standard Oil so powerful? Why can't we have a European version of Standard Oil? Or tariff policies and so on. So there are all kinds of subjects on which he might lecture people or harangue them. And John Royle thought that this stemmed from a combination of the rather crudely handled birth, oxygen insufficiency, hypoxemia, I think is the term that's used, and later neurosis-inducing pressures in his life as a prince in the royal family. So that's the argument.
To be clear, that we're not going to be able to draw that direct parallel with the current president of the United States, maybe the neuroticization later in life. But if there is a medical explanation here, then we are talking about two very distinct forms of incontinence. That description that I gave from your book, which does, it certainly chimes with, I think, how some people see Trump, but I don't think anyone thinks Trump's birth caused it.
No, and I don't think we're making a case here for the comparison. We're not saying that the same personality popped up twice at different places and different times, but it's more that it's useful for thinking about both of them, to put them into each other's vicinity. The argument about the obstetrical predicaments of the infant Kaiser, it's not the final word, because, there was none of the doctors present at the time noticed serious impairments in the newborn child. He didn't appear to be blue. He was in motion. He moved. He screamed and so on, responded normally to everything else. It's just that the arm was not responsive. And so it's doubtful whether he actually was neurologically damaged in that way. But the difficulties of growing up in that family were pretty clear. He had an extremely rather overwhelming relationship with his mother, and there are some interesting early letters to his mother when there's a sort of Oedipal dimension to this. He writes to her a letter in which he says, "Mummy, I keep thinking about your hands, and I want to kiss your hands, and I want to kiss them very long and slowly, and so on. I want to smell them because they smell so nice, and in particular, I want to kiss the sort of soft inside part of your hand, not the outside that other people get to kiss, but the soft inside part." And, he's 14 or something at the time, a pubescent boy. And these are not letters that every mother really would welcome from her 14-year-old son. And indeed, her response was rather dismissive. She said, "Oh, for goodness sake, what are you going on about my hands? I'm looking at them right now. They're covered in ink and paint because I've been doing a painting. How silly. Stop talking about them. By the way, you have 11 different spelling errors in your letter, and I've circled them in red ink, and I'm sending it back to you." So that's why Thomas Kohlhuth, the psychohistorian, argued that, there was an insufficient mirroring regard in the relationship between the parents and the child. There was a sort of emotional deficit. But that's also been cast in question. Other historians have argued that actually it was a rather warm family setting. So the argument will go on, and there's no point in continuing it further here. But certainly, the people did wonder whether there was something wrong with the man.
So when he became Kaiser and this style of communication suddenly became the mode of expression of their head of state in a society in which mass circulation newspapers were on the rise, in which he could communicate to large numbers of people. So it's not the 20th century to begin with, never mind the 21st, but we are already in the age of mass communication media, and journalists and others were very eager to hear from him. How shocking, by the conventional standards of the time, was his mode of communication? To what extent at the time did people think this was both shocking and dangerous? Because it was a fraught time, and to have the head of state willing to unburden himself of his thoughts in a random, haphazard, opinionated, often borderline deranged way, how dangerous was that thought to be?
Well, that is a much less easy question to answer than it sounds, because, some of his utterances, he's actually someone who's much more famous or infamous for what he said than he is for what he actually did. That's one of the interesting features of his place in history and of his reputation. The most famous example of a speech which really did depart from the norms of decorum of that time was the so-called Hans speech, which he gave at Bremerhaven as, to a body of troops who were about to embark for the expedition to China to put down the Boxer Rebellion, as an international European expedition in which the Russians and the French and other states were also participating. And he addressed these troops, and at first he stuck to the text he'd been given, which had been pasted onto a little wooden board, and he read from that. That was an anodyne speech, good luck, and we know you'll serve well, and you'll remember us, the home fires will always be burning, blah, blah, blah. But then after a while, as he sort of felt his way into the grandeur of this position, he is the warlord speaking to his troops, he started to wander off the text that had been offered, and he said, when you're out there, remember, these are Chinamen. No mercy will be given. Pardon wird nicht gegeben. There will be no mercy with these people. I want you to behave like the Huns of old. You will be like the Huns of yore. In 1,000 years, no Chinaman will even dare to look sideways at a German soldier. Such will be the terror you will strike into ... and so on and so forth. Well, the members of the civil cabinet, which were in charge of kind of controlling outbursts of this kind, led by a rather wonderful man called Valentini, who's one of the long-suffering characters of the Kaiser's story, immediately they found out to get hold of the journalists and prevent them from publishing what they'd actually heard, and gave them instead something much closer to what he'd been supposed to say. But unbeknownst to them, a journalist had sort of crept up onto the top of a nearby building with a stenographic device and took the whole thing down using his stenographic device, and then disappeared from the scene before he could be sort of captured and committed to a gentleman's agreement. I mean, those are the sort of decorous days of the turn of the 20th century where, if you said to a journalist, "Oh, please, this is quite important to us, don't publish this," they'd say, "Very well, it will be done," and off they would go. Well, this chap was never committed to that, and so it appeared in the kind of local paper and then was very quickly syndicated and picked up everywhere across Germany. And it caused an appalling upset in the parliament. People said, "How can this man be stopped? This is outrageous," and so on, and it's so embarrassing. And it was a serious pushback from the parliament, and the first time that the royal person had ever been handled in that way in public debate. So, there was a response. But interestingly, if you look closely into the contemporary records, people find that not everybody disliked this speech. The troops liked it. And the trains from which troops which had been mustered and, were being assembled at Bremerhaven for further embarkations, as they travelled through Germany, it was noted that chalked on the outside of their carriages were "Pardon wird nicht gegeben," mercy will not be given, no quarter will be given, and so on. So for them, it became a kind of way of branding their enterprise. They thought it was quite exciting. And Delcasse, the French foreign minister, reported that there was an enormous enthusiasm in France for this speech. Because, of course, at this point, it was a Franco-German, European, Russian, and other powers joint enterprise. So it's complicated. What often happened with the Kaiser's speeches was that they would go down brilliantly with the particular audience he was talking to. So, for example, he might be talking to a bunch of Junkers in some rather clubby rural atmosphere, and he'd say something like, "Prussia's wings extend over Germany," or something like that, language which was music to the ears of the Junkers of Brandenburg and so on, but was not music to the ears of, bourgeois history professors in Munich and Stuttgart and so, who had no desire to be under the wings of Prussia, because Germany was not Prussia. Germany was a federation, and Bavaria was also a very confident dynastic state with its own king. And then there was the King of Württemberg, and there was the King of Saxony, and these other states had their own parliaments and laws and monarchies and so on. So a speech that might go down very well in one context could cause, tremendous upset in other contexts. So it was this plurality of different contexts that the Kaiser never quite learned to manage. And he found it extremely frustrating when people pushed back like this. There's a very good letter from his intimate, a man called Philip Eulenburg, who writes to him and says, "Your Majesty, lovely speech. I mean, really cracking speech." And people rightly said, among those people in Brandenburg, they rightly said what a wonderful speech it was. However, read in the cold light of the morning in a cafe in Munich by your typical sort of South German professor, the speech doesn't go down quite so well. And so there are plenty of people who are willing to tell him this. And the interesting thing is, and it's quite interesting if we're thinking of Wilhelm as a way of understanding, how to measure the singular quality of Trump, that one thing about the Kaiser was that when people presented him with these negative commentaries in the press, he was devastated. he would collapse. He was actually very thin-skinned, and he would collapse, go silent. He'd often go to bed for several days or even a week. He would be very poorly and very, very unhappy. And of course, he didn't quite understand, why was this happening? Why is it happening to me? And he would often say, which betrayed a deep misunderstanding of the problem that he was in, he would say, don't I have the right to free speech? Everybody else has the right to say what they want. Bob the postman can say whatever he likes. Why can't I? As the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, why am I not allowed to have free speech? The fact is that this wasn't a free speech issue. It was an issue about role strain. It was about the problem of having too many different roles. He was the Emperor of Germany. Well, he wasn't the Emperor of Germany, that's the whole point. He was the German Emperor, the Deutscher Kaiser, not the Kaiser von Deutschland or the Kaiser Deutschlands. He was the King of Prussia as well. But, if he wanted to travel to Bavaria, they had to ask permission of the King of Bavaria. Can we enter your territory? It was that kind of federation. So he was a warlord in the sense that he was, in theory, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, though he never, ever was capable or able or allowed to actually perform that role in practice. And he was the Summus Episcopus of the Church of the Prussian Union. So he had all these different roles, priestly, sort of sacerdotal, military, and imperial and royal. And the interplay between these roles would have made complex demands on any individual, and I'm afraid they made very complex demands on him, and demands which he was completely incapable of rising to.
I want to read you another couple of quotes from your book, if you don't mind me reading back your book to you. You said of Wilhelm, he lacked the kind of intellectual detachment and synoptic vision that could draw disparate things together, identify common themes, analyse implications, and draw reasoned general conclusions. And you also wrote of him, this is a question, not a statement, was this drive for power placed in the service of a policy of any kind, or did it exhaust itself in demonstrative, planless acts of self-assertion? That phrase, demonstrative, planless acts of self-assertion, also reminds me of someone else. But in what you just described, this ability to connect with people in a room or in the moment and enter in the spirit of his speech, go beyond the text, clearly had some ability to reach out to people in front of him, provoking horror among the respectable classes, but then also sometimes the third level to this, speaking directly to ordinary Germans who might not have been nearly as horrified as the professor in the Munich cafe thinks they ought to have been about no quarter given, we are the Huns, and so on. Is there any plausible way in which he was also a kind of populist, in the sense that he spoke beyond the people who wanted to rein him in to an audience that quite liked the fact that he didn't seem to hold his tongue?
That's a really interesting question, because it looks like a populist tactics to adopt the sort of vulgar parlance and the boulevard, middle-of-the-road ideas of the great mass of the population to outrage the intelligentsia, but, resonate with the great mass of the people and so on. Except that I'm not aware that the Kaiser was doing this deliberately. I think the Kaiser did have a genuinely rather unsophisticated cultural outlook. He referred to French Impressionism as gutter art, for example. He said it was the art of the gutter. And that was appalling to people who went to, museums and art galleries and so on in Berlin, and which had an incredibly sophisticated culture-consuming bourgeoisie. But, it made sense to a lot of normal Germans who thought, what a load of rubbish. So the effect was populist, or at least it was popular. And quite often, as we were talking about this before, cracking speeches that were embarrassing to educated readers might be rather likable in the eyes of less educated readers. And there's a difference between public opinion and published opinion. He didn't do so well in published opinion. That was the opinion produced by newspaper editors and the smart elites, as people sometimes call them today. But in public opinion, the opinion of the great mass, there seemed to be actually quite a lot of positive resonance with what he said. And positive resonance with his person. People said, well, okay, he jumps around a lot. I mean, it is interesting that even physically he was very restless. Whenever you look at, there's a lot of film material of the Kaiser, and when you look at films in which the Kaiser is present, he's the most mobile part of the picture, moving around, adjusting something, picking at this, moving his helmet, putting his helmet back on again, and so on. So people noticed this and they thought, well, he's energetic. This is the man who represents us, and he's energetic, jumping around, and he's kind of virile and manly and has strong opinions, and that's as it should be. We're Germany, we're young and virile and mobile, and we're leaping about because we're a bit restless. What's wrong with that? So it's a complex picture there. If you ask the question, is this populist? It wasn't populism, I don't think, because the Kaiser didn't need that kind of mass assent in order to, it wasn't really part of the repertoire of things that he needed to wield power. His power came from other sources, and in many ways his power came from much closer to those educated elites that he needed to keep happy and often didn't. But its effect was similar to that of populism. It revealed that sort of, leapfrogging quality of certain forms of public parlance, that they pass over the heads of the educated elites who curate public opinion, but land quite happily amongst the sort of mass of people who don't read quality newspapers.
And yet the first assertion of his power when he became Kaiser was the removal of Bismarck, effectively. He asserted himself against the most powerful man in the state, and he did it by choosing the issue of the anti-socialist legislation that Bismarck wanted to maintain, by speaking the Kaiser, in a sense, on the side of the workers. I mean, he did assert himself, first of all, in German politics as someone who was, I don't know what the correct term for this would be now, but let's say it's on the more liberal wing, but certainly on the side of German politics where he claimed to be standing up for ordinary Germans against a conservative elite.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
That's true. He did, and he picked that issue because he knew it would drive Bismarck, into a rage, which it did. And those final scenes in the relationship between, it would have been wonderful to be a fly on the wall as, Bismarck burst into tears, for example, on several occasions, and tried to sort of, by the sheer force of his personality, cower the Kaiser, but without success. That William was simply too determined and too callow to respond to any of that. But he dug Bismarck out of his perch and forced him into a resignation by siding with the workers. But, that doesn't mean that there was any sincere empathy with the plight of Germany's workers. On other occasions when there was a mass demonstration motivated by social concerns or by workers' rights and so on, he would advise the troops to be sent in, shoot as many as possible and so on. But it is interesting that he got rid of Bismarck because I think he regarded Bismarck was this titanic figure who had, presided over German politics since 1871, who had been the co-architect of this new Germany, whose power was seen as having overshadowed even the previous 2 emperors, and in particular William I, who was on the throne until 1888 when he died. And famously, William I is reported to have said, "It's really tough being a Kaiser under a Chancellor like Bismarck." So that was how the relationship was seen. Though, interesting enough, right now there is a sort of revisionism underway, and 2 new books have just appeared about Kaiser Wilhelm I, arguing that the Kaiser was really in charge and Bismarck wasn't. And the jury is out as to whether this revisionism will succeed in changing everyone's mind, but certainly these are 2 powerful new interventions. So these questions are all still in contention. And just thinking about this question about whether it's a populism or not, I think its roots lie in something else, and that is a kind of quasi-religious understanding, which was not unusual for the Prussian monarchs, of their relationship with the people as a sort of mystical union, almost something instituted by God, a mystical union with everybody. And so there was a sort of sense that, all Germans had a sort of sacred relationship with the emperor, and that entitled him to speak for everyone and to everyone. And I think that is, in a sense, the root of this behavior, which looks populist, but is actually rooted in something different.
I think it's fair to say that for the political establishment in Germany, the real fear with Wilhelm was not that he might say something that would outrage bourgeois opinion but might strike a chord with ordinary Germans, but that he would say something that would outrage both establishment and ordinary opinion in other countries. So the real danger of this sort of incontinent willingness to speak his mind was if he was to say something in a very delicate international situation, all sorts of alliances having to be formed, maintained in Europe and beyond, a dangerous age for the reasons that 1914 showed, that he would say things that might, well, land okay with ordinary Germans, but would absolutely outrage international opinion in one way or another. And the most notorious example of that is the interview he gave in 1907 to the Daily Telegraph. And that, in many ways, that's the thing for which he is still not best remembered, but before 1914, it's the thing that helps define his historical image. Just tell us what he said, but also why it was so thought to be so incendiary.
Yes, well, the Daily Telegraph interview was an interview he gave with a man called Wortley Montagu, who was a personal friend, and they met in Highcliffe Castle and had a sort of private chat, which Wortley Montagu then turned into an interview and gave to the Telegraph.
So he was stitched up a bit.
No, actually, he wasn't stitched up by the British because, in fact, the interview was passed to him. They said, is this okay? Can we go ahead and print this? So the British interlocutor actually did everything that he was expected to do and sent it to the Kaiser for authorization. The stitch-up, if it happened, probably had more to do with the German Chancellor, because the Kaiser, having seen the text of the interview and thinking, I hope that's okay. I mean, I think it looks wonderful, but I'd better check, because he had been in trouble before. I've been in trouble for this kind of thing before, so I'd better check with Bülow, the Chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, and make sure that it's okay. So he had it sent to Bernhard von Bülow, but Bernhard von Bülow was on vacation. He was on the island of Norderney having his summer rest, and so the question then arises, did Bülow read the text and sign it off, or did he simply never see it, which is what he claimed? Bülow later claimed, I never saw this thing, it's very embarrassing, it's terrible, and refused to defend the Kaiser. So he may have been stitched up by the Chancellor, but the evidence all suggests that he tried to behave in a constitutional fashion and have the interview authorized by the appropriate personnel. In any case, the content of the interview, well, in many ways, if you read it now, it seems much of a muchness. It's a silly interview in which he says things like, I don't know why you British people are all in a fuss about me. I mean, I love Britain. I am British. I mean, look at me. I'm British, and I love being here, and I love your bagpipes and your lovely gardens, and my grandmother, my lovely grandmother, I loved her very, very much, and I was with her when she died, and I tried to help. I tried to help in the Boer War. I sent advice. This is how you can win it. Not what you're doing. It's all wrong. I really tried to help. And, nobody will give me credit for this. But you British are mad. You're mad as March hares on this question. I mean, yes, do the Germans dislike Britain? Yes, most of them do. But I don't. I really love it. So, stop making a fuss about that. And so it went on like that, right?
And apart from the accent, that really does sound like Trump. I mean, it's uncanny, actually, the content of that. That mixture of the plangent tones, the personalization of everything. You people don't understand. I love you. Okay, I hate you, but I love you.
Exactly. I actually love you guys. What's wrong with you guys? I love you guys. Exactly. I love you guys. And so on. So that's right. And the thing is that then it was published. And, I think the British just thought, more nonsense from the king of nonsense. But in Germany, it caused this tremendous, it was like a sort of nervous breakdown of the media. People were so embarrassed by it. And you can see why. There's a kind of infantile quality to it. And also a profound indiscretion. Giving tips about how to win the Boer War and so on. How embarrassing is that? And also then saying most Germans don't like Britain. Well, the Germans resented that too. Why is he speaking for us? We like Britain, and so on. So it just went down incredibly badly and was seen as an intervention, the behavior of a rogue ambassador, speaking for German foreign policy or in an international environment with possible foreign political or geopolitical consequences in a way that was completely irresponsible. So then the question arose, how can he be silenced in the future, and, what can be done about this man? In the meanwhile, the pushback, the negative feedback and so on precipitated Wilhelm II into one of these depressions, which he suffered whenever this kind of thing happened. He plunged into bed. He was just not seen anywhere, became completely silent. In fact, scarcely appeared in public until the next terrible discretion about 3 years later in 1910, when he said, "The Prussian eagle is once again spreading its wings across Europe." Oops, another uproar. So, it remained throughout his life. One of the things about Wilhelm is that you can't write a Bildungsroman about Wilhelm. You can't write a novel of education, evolution, and development in which at the end the central protagonist has achieved a wisdom and an overview which was lacking, which was not present in the callow, youthful version, because Wilhelm II doesn't ever seem to have learned anything. He suffered, but he didn't learn. So he's a bit like a character in Seinfeld. He just remained the same throughout his life. And his mother, who had already said when he was a young man, she'd said, "God, I wish someone could put a padlock on William's mouth whenever he's in a public situation, because it's so embarrassing. As soon as he opens his mouth, nonsense comes out." So, this just remained the case, a sort of verbal incontinence. And what's interesting, though, if we're thinking now about, again, we're not saying, Trump is Wilhelm or Wilhelm is Trump and so on. Obviously not. Personalities are singularities. They can't be conflated with each other in that way or even really compared meaningfully. But what's interesting is the response that in Wilhelm's era, a very robust public sphere pushed back very, very hard, because this was indecorous behavior. It was risky and, reckless, and he took a real beating. And what I think that tells us is something about the difference between then and now. The public sphere was still that Habermasian public sphere in the sense that it was theorized and idealized by Jürgen Habermas, the great German sociologist, as a space of reason-giving and dialogical contestation. It was an energetic, critical sphere which was constantly pushing back against government and authority and working out complex questions in a relatively autonomous way. And there were many newspapers in Germany which employed famous journalists or had famous editors and served very passionately loyal readerships in their respective regional environments, because it was a highly regionalized country, Germany. Extremely regionalized. And so you had a kind of muscular public sphere in a way that you just don't now, because the public sphere has just evaporated and turned into an endless sort of panoply of tiny mini publics curated by online wizards of this or that political color. So it's a different setting in that sense, that the resistance to it was much stronger.
It was also an age in which, at the very top, particularly among monarchical heads of state, personal relationships really mattered. Some of them were related to each other, they knew each other, they communicated directly with each other. So there was also a question about whether Wilhelm's personality was dangerous in that context too, and that does have some echoes now. We live in an age with a less robust public sphere, or at least a more fragmented public sphere, but also it's an age in which really high politics. Trump tours the world and claims personal relationships with a very small number of people whom he thinks he can manage. I want to read you one more line from your book of Wilhelm. This also reminds me of someone. He was angry with the Tsar 1 week, but infatuated with him the next. He reacted with fury to perceived slights and provocations, but panicked at the prospect of genuine confrontation or conflict. In an age of hyper-personalized, very high politics, that was dangerous. It was even recognized at the time that was dangerous.
Well, it's interesting you put it like that, because in some ways, again, this is an interesting way to play with the categories, because in some ways, personalized politics was what was expected of a monarch. And, the argument that Chancellor Bülow made when he was pressed on the indiscretions of the Kaiser, one of the things he said, well, look, what do you want? This is a monarchy. A monarchy is a flesh and blood form of political authority, in which the mystery of the Constitution is actually clothed in a human body. And that means there's a guy who's going to be doing and saying stuff, and he's a human being like anyone else, fallible, prone to excesses, or emotions, and so on. And that's what you get within a monarchy. You get personality is at the center. And yet, the consensus was that this personality had to be reined in, contained. Its public communications had to be censored. And its behavior had to be very closely watched and monitored. And in fact, very robust sort of controls emerged around the Kaiser to prevent him from causing damage or from intervening in the processes of government in ways that would, destabilize the system. So in some ways, what people spent most of their time doing, and this is great waste on time and resources and emotion and energy and so on, was managing the Kaiser. The Kaiser had to be heavily managed by the people around him, and a sort of group of people emerged who were really old hands at doing this. I think that's one interesting point of contrast with the present.
That line that you say, he panicked at the prospect of genuine confrontation or conflict. So the examples that we've given of his incontinent speech, some of it is very belligerent. We are the Huns, we will give no quarter, and so on. And yet in 1914, when the prospect of genuine conflict loomed very large and panicked a lot of people, did it panic him? I mean, so when he actually finally faced the moment where the possibility of not just some skirmish somewhere on the edges of the empire, but a European war stared him in the face, how did he react?
Well, with something closely approaching panic, and also with a determination to, if he could, to stop it from happening. But to come back to that contrast, I mean, if we go back to 1905, there's a conversation on record between him and Leopold of the Belgians, in which he sits down and says, we're a bit worried the French could attack Germany at some point, and if that were to happen, we'd expect Belgium to support us, and if you did, we'd give you, some lands from France, and if you didn't support us, well, we'd have to take a large part of Belgium. That's just the way things are. And this was so upsetting to King Leopold of the Belgians that when he got up, he put his helmet on the wrong way round. And to make matters worse, these remarks were made at his birthday party. So, you can imagine, how was your birthday, darling? Well, I went there and one of the guests threatened to invade me. And there's a whole kind of background to that exchange between William and Leopold, but it's an example of that kind of what looks like a very belligerent tone of voice and ridiculous imagined scenarios of violence and mayhem and so on. And yet in 1914, when the danger of a real war loomed large, Wilhelm jammed his feet down on the brakes. He initially said, surely when he got the reply from the Serbs to the Austrian ultimatum, his first reaction was, well, that seems fine. Great. Okay, let's move on. Nothing to see here. Everybody go home. And then when it was actually at the beginning of August, when it was time to mobilize or not, because the Russians were mobilizing and the Germans were, for complicated reasons we don't have time to go into now, committed to a plan which would respond to a Russian invasion in the east with an attack on France, being the allies of Russia. The question arose as to whether the mobilization order should be given. Wilhelm refused to relinquish the hope that the British might be persuaded to remain neutral and might even be persuaded to keep the French out of the conflict. And in order to keep that possibility open, it was a fairly quixotic possibility, a largely fantasized possibility. In order to keep that open, he told Moltke he wanted the mobilization to be stopped. He wanted the troops to stop marching. And Moltke said, we can't stop the troops from marching. This army is it covers an entire landscape. It's already in motion. You can't just say to an army like that, they've got to stop. That can't be done. We're committed to the railway routes. What will happen to the railways? And the Kaiser said, your uncle would have given me a different answer, referring to the famous Moltke of the Wars of Unification. And he said, if I say it, it must be done. And indeed, an order went out, stop the mobilization. And the men who were at the front of the German army, who had already got into Luxembourg, they'd already breached Luxembourg's neutrality, but they hadn't yet entered Belgium, they sat down on their haversacks and they waited for further orders. And this went on for several hours until the news came through there is no prospect of a British neutrality or British undertaking to remain neutral, and certainly no prospect of the French standing off on instructions from London. And so then the Kaiser says, very well, go ahead, that's it then. So these are examples of how, when push came to shove, he did try to stop the worst from happening, albeit in a way which is very ad hoc and not particularly well thought through or strategically oppressive. But it gives us a sense of the complexity of his relationship with these questions. And many contemporaries observed this. Poincaré said this is a man who speaks up very loudly, but when danger approaches, he suddenly becomes very quiet and timid. Many people had noted this. But, what did that mean for perceptions of German policy? Was it a good thing or a bad thing? It was probably a bad thing because it increased the levels of uncertainty in the system. And that, I think, is important, that nobody knew exactly how much weight Wilhelm carried within the German decision-making apparatus, and nobody knew what he was going to say next. That's already a large dose of uncertainty. It made the Austrians uncertain, for example. And that uncertainty within the Austro-German alliance was probably a risk-heightening rather than a risk-diminishing factor. In general, the story of 1914 seems to me to suggest that alliances in which the Allies are uncertain of each other are more risk-prone than alliances where everybody knows what everybody else is thinking and is working together in concert.
So in the second part of this conversation, we are going to talk about Trump. And I'm sure people listening will have their own views about which of the things that we've discussed so far may or may not carry across to a discussion of Trump's power and his personality. The last point that you make seems to me to be a very important one in 2025. Some of the danger of Trump sometimes is thought to be the intemperateness, the erraticness, the willingness to say things that outrage respectable opinion and also are absolute provocations. We don't know what Trump would do if he had to face a choice where there was the prospect of a real war. I don't think we have any idea, actually, whether he is Wilhelm or whether he's not Wilhelm. But it's the uncertainty that is the danger. And in a complex international environment where the stakes are higher now than they were then, because it's a world with nuclear weapons, and in which there are many flashpoints, many possible sites of conflict, you could say uncertainty is the most dangerous thing of all. And this kind of political personality, the thing that outrages people about it, may not matter all that much. He says things that then get broadcast in a way that infuriates some people and galvanizes others and so on and so forth. But at the top level, and the people who work around Trump, and we'll talk about this in part 2 of the conversation, how to think about the court of Trump. But in that context, uncertainty could be the most dangerous thing of all. And you've described in Wilhelm someone, for all of his consistency, he never grew up, he never changed. There is no Bildungsroman to be written about him. But he was consistently very hard to read, in the sense it's very hard to know what was really there. There was no substance there. And in that context, the danger is the emptiness.
Yes, although if we're thinking now about just putting these two personalities together, Wilhelm had a kind of an inner life, I think. He had cultural passions.
Well, so does Trump. They're just not the kind of cultural passions that the bourgeois elite like. Trump is passionate about beauty contests and golf and wrestling. And I've seen him and heard him on podcasts talk like a genuine enthusiast about things that I'm not myself hugely enthusiastic about, but he doesn't sound like he's faking it.
That's an interesting point. He does have passions, I suppose, yeah. And wrestling is a culture. It's really important and actually also really difficult not to come to crass judgments about Trump, because Trump is not us. He's not speaking in the kind of placating, likable way to people like us. It's very easy to respond with overstatements, exaggerations and binary either-or judgments. Whereas the key point about Trump is he's a complex figure. He's complex in his functionality, and he relates in a complex way to the things and the people around him. So it's actually not easy to get to the bottom of Trump at all, and it wasn't easy to get to the bottom of Wilhelm II. They were both complex in that way.
And they also both sit at the very center of extremely complex political systems. So the German political system at this time had its own complicated uncertainties at the heart of it, where power really lay, what were the limits of what could or couldn't be done, what was the role of mass politics. It was a democratic state in its way, but also with very, very severe limits on how democratic forces could exercise their own power. So you have a sort of knowable, unknowable person. So someone with an easily caricatured personality could be painted in very broad brush ways, predictable in lots of ways, predictable in the outrage that he caused, but also a real uncertainty around him. Exactly how far will he go? What will he do when it comes to the crunch? Do we actually know what he's afraid of? At the heart of a very complex political system. And it's the interplay between those two things that in many ways is where the real flashpoints lie. And that was true then as it is now. I think the story of 1914 is partly the story of a very complex political system at the heart of which was highly personalized power.
One of the central strands in the narrative of 1914 used to be the so-called Willy-Nicky telegrams, the telegrams exchanged between the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, and Wilhelm II of Germany. It's true they're written in a chatty, friendly, jocular style, quite emotional, please think again, don't take the risk of mobilizing, and so on, your dearest Willie, and so on. But in fact, a closer analysis of these telegrams reveals that they were vetted on both sides of the exchange by their respective foreign officers. So these were not person-to-person signaling between two cousins who were fond of each other. They were actually very carefully vetted international signals between two states, expressed in the form of a personal telegram.
With Trump's phone calls, chummy, chatty, some of them. So he's not always a monster. He's perfectly capable of being a charmer as well. And he is often on the phone to world leaders, buttering them up as well as calling them out. But he's doing this at the heart of an extraordinarily complex, but also, it seems to me, fragile in its way, political system. I mean, one in which the calibrations are very finely tuned. You've got this blunderbuss personality at the heart of a very finely calibrated political system at a time when the stakes are extraordinarily high. And you can't just say the blunderbuss personality is the danger or the threat. It is the interplay of those three things which we should be concerned about. Our next episode is part 2 of my conversation with Chris about Trump-like leaders in German history. We're going to be looking in more detail at Bismarck and asking, bizarre as it might seem, whether Trump has Bismarckian qualities or did Bismarck have Trump-like qualities. But we're also going to be broadening the conversation out to ask the fundamental question: what is the right frame of reference for understanding a politician like Trump? Is it presidents and chancellors? Is it tyrants and dictators? Or is it really emperors and kings? You'll also hear Chris's pretty good Donald Trump impression. That's all next time. Do please join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.